Alhamdulillah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala brought us to verse 116 in Surah An-Nisa. And as we discussed before, Surah An-Nisa is a very beautiful surah. It talks about so many different things. It talks about the relationship between men and women, how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created us from nafs al-wahida. It also speaks about the issues of war and peace. And then we see here in this verse, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala speaks about tawheed and shirk. And this is extremely important because when you read the Quran is not simply just stories. We have, for instance, Surah Yusuf. We see also in the Quran that it's not just commandments, halal and haram, do this, don't do that. But we see that in each surah, we see that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala weaves in the ahkam with the qisas, the rulings with the stories. And with the stories, with the akhirah, talking about heaven and hell. And we see with issues of heaven and hell, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala brings us the issue of tawheed. So here Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in this verse says, إِنَّ اللَّهَ لَا يَغْفِرُ أَن يُشْرَكَ بِهِ وَيَغْفِرُ مَا دُونَ ذَلِكَ لِمَن يَشَاءُ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that God does not forgive the worship of others beside Him, though He does forgive whoever He will for lesser sins. For whoever does this has gone far, far astray. In His place, the idolaters invoke only females, and Satan, the rebel, God rejected, who said, I will certainly take my due share of your servants. So here Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala begins and says that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will forgive everything. So think of every single sin that one could possibly imagine, whether in terms of human relations, whether in terms of what we say, whether in terms of things we may do. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says He will forgive everything, except those who do shirk. So this is the paramount sin. This is the cardinal sin in Islam. And He will forgive anything else besides that. وَمَن يُشْرِكْ بِاللَّهِ فَقَدْ ضَلَّ ضَلَالًا بَعِيدًا. And whoever does shirk, he or that person or she has gone far, far astray. And here the ulama, Ibn Rajab al-Hanbali, he mentioned something very beautiful in particular. He said, why is it, we ask in Islam, that we just don't say that God is one, but rather in our shahada we say, La ilaha illallah. That we deny first the idea of shirk, that we deny the idea of worshipping other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then we start with La, and we start with illallah. And he says that this has to do with the idea of love. That when we are saying this, we are saying that we love Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala more than anything else. Allahu Akbar. That is the essence of tawheed. And that's why shirk is condemned. Because shirk is saying that part, literally in Arabic, shirk is a portion or a part or a share. That part of your heart, part of your soul is devoted to something else other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And just like in our families, in our relationships, we want to feel that we're the priority. We go to work, you want to feel noticed. You go home, you want your spouse to recognize you. You want your parents not to be distracted and listen to you. You want your kids to heed your attention. The Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala here emphasizes the idea of tawheed, that there can be no other part of our heart and our soul that is totally devoted to something else. And that's why Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyah, when he talks about the story of Ibrahim alayhi salam and Ismail, many people, when they read the story of the sacrifice, they say, why is there this violence and killing children? And we see that this story, there's no violence. No one passes away. No one is killed. Rather, it ends, it says, Salamun ala Ibrahim. Peace be upon Ibrahim. That Ibrahim alayhi salam, why was he asked to kill his son, sacrifice, adhbah? And Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyah, he said, because this is a story of love. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wanted to not see any blood or bloodshed. That's not the goal of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He doesn't want to see violence on earth. Rather, He wanted to see what was the priority in Ibrahim alayhi salam's heart. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will test us, each and every one of us. See, who do we really love? Because love, as we know, is attached to ta'ah, to obedience and action. So if you want to know what are you going to do, how are you going to act in this world, just ask yourself, who are you loving? Because if you love your spouse, then your spouse asks you to do something, you will do it. If you love your kids, you'll follow through. If you love your friends, your workplace. So love is very much connected to how we live in this world. And that's why when we look at the sin of shirk, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala condemns it. Because if your heart slowly begins to move away from the worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, from the love of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then your actions will follow suit. That we see that shirk, in many ways, is the beginning of ma'siyah, of disobedience to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That every sin goes back to the heart and to its inclinations. That if we love something other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, so much we are willing to disobey Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala continues to say, why is this? Why do people commit shirk? This is the question. If it's so much condemned. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, إِن يَدْعُونَ مِن دُونِهِ إِلَّا إِنَاثًا. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, what did the kuffar of Quraysh they do? That they used to call on other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And they used to say that these people are the daughters of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So the majority of the mufassirin, they say these were the idols in Mecca. And they were called Lat wa Uzza wa Manat. أَفَرَأَيْتُمُ اللَّاتَ وَالْعُزَّى وَمَنَاتَ ثَالِثَةَ الْأُخْرَى. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala actually names these idols in the Quran. These were the idols that the Meccans worshipped. Now where did these idols come from? The original deen of Mecca and Arabia and the entire world was that of Ibrahim alayhi salam. And we know this from the Quran and the traditions. It was the idea of the Hunafa, the Hanifa, that we're going to worship only one God. This is the idea of Tawheed. But the Arabs, they used to travel in the caravans. We know, Ilaf al-Quraysh, this rihla, shita'i wa slayf, that they would go in the summer and winter months. And when they would get the goods, they would learn from the other people their religions. And I had the opportunity even recently to go to Jordan and some of the southern parts of Jordan, Petra. You see that the gods there, the Lat or Uzza, these female gods, they imported them to Mecca. And they started to worship them. But then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Quran says, you in your society, you look down upon women. You look down upon your daughters. You even bury them alive, these banat. But then when it comes to God, you say God has daughters. The God is female. The God has all these feminine attributes. So in their life, they would praise masculinity in men. But then in their worship, they would put the gods up high and begin to worship them. وَإِن يَدْعُونَ إِلَّا شَيْطَانٍ مَرِيدًا. Subhanallah. And then who led them astray? Is that shaitan. That shaitan, the marid, the one that rebelled against Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he is the one that slowly took people. They took their hearts to the worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describes shaitan. لَعَنَهُ اللَّهُ. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala cursed shaitan. And then he quotes a statement of shaitan. And this is something that's very beautiful in the Quran, is the quotations. We always should look closely. That sometimes there's a general description, but then we see a quotation of a particular character. And here, this is a quotation of shaitan. He says, وَقَالَ لَأَتَّخِذَنَّ مِنْ عِبَادِكَ نَصِيبًا مَفْرُوضًا. SubhanAllah. That when shaitan, when he rebelled against Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he made a promise. He said, I'm going to take from your servants, the mukhlisin, the righteous, I'm going to take a portion of them with me to the hellfire. And this is something Sheikh Majid always mentions, that the idea of the crab. That if one crab is leaving, the other one will grab them and pull them back down into the boiling water. Now this is the worst type. There's different types of sin. So the one type of sin, the individual, they'll do it privately. They don't want anyone to know. Another type of sin is that they'll do it in a group, so they feel confident. And another type of sin is that if they see someone escaping, they won't let them escape. They will take them with them. He said, if I'm going down, you're going down with me. And this is the idea of shaitan, that he promised to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And we see this in the Quran itself, where when he was leaving paradise, he asked Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for something. He said, قَالَ فَأَنذِرْنِي إِلَى يَوْمِ يُبْعَثُونَ. He said to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, just give me a little bit of time until Yawm al-Qiyamah. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala responded and said, قَالَ إِنَّكَ مِنَ الْمُنذَرِينَ. He said, verily, you can wait. I won't punish you at this moment, at this time. And then he says, قَالَ فِي مَا أَغْوَيْتَنِي لَأَقْعُدَنَّ لَهُمْ صِرَاطَكَ الْمُسْتَقِيمِ. Subhanallah. Then he said, from these people that I have gone astray, I will lie in ambush. I will sit down literally waiting for the people on your straight path. Subhanallah. Now imagine all of us are walking on the straight path, but there's someone there hiding on the side of the path, trying to literally pull you astray, pull you away, put something else in your heart that you will love, and then lead to ma'siyah, to disobedience. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then he explains and says, ثُمَّ لَآتِيَنَّهُمْ مِنْ بَيْنِ أَيْدِيهِمْ. He said, I will come in front of them. وَمِنْ خَلْفِهِمْ, and from behind them. عَنْ أَيْمَانِهِمْ, from their right, وَعَنْ شَمَالِهِمْ, and their left. And then you will find that أَكْثَرَهُمْ are not shakirin. Right? وَلَا تَجِدُوا أَكْثَرَهُمْ شَاكِرِينَ. You will not find the majority of them grateful to you. So subhanAllah, we see here that Shaitan has made this a vow, that he will take a portion of the righteous servants away from the worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So brothers and sisters in Islam, to conclude, we see that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about the idea of shirk, that he will forgive everything. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is tawwab, he's ghafoor rahim. Part of his definition is his mercy, that he gives mercy to his believers. And part of his mercy is that he forgives, that he is qawi, he is all-powerful, he's aziz, he's jabbar, that he has the ability to punish anyone because of their disobedience. But because of his mercy, he is always willing to forgive, except that of shirk. And why shirk, such that the cardinal sin in Islam? It's because it's about putting part of our heart to something else. That we make Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala a lesser being, that he does not become our priority in our life. And then if we look into our heart and we look into our soul, we see that it's important for us to make Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala the ultimate destination that we want to meet on Yawm al-Qiyamah, and with the ultimate love. Because love leads to action. And if your heart is separated, of course we can love many things, but the priority has to be Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that love will lead to our worship, our salawat. It will lead to us giving zakat. It will lead us to go to Hajj. It will lead us to fast the month of Ramadan and the extra nawafil. That we have to check our hearts and make sure that other things do not distract us from the love of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And we see in these verses the idea of anthropomorphism, that the people of Mecca, they felt Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was far away. So what did they do? They imported these idols. They brought these idols from different places, and they started to worship them, and they started to say Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has a father, or like a mother, or has daughters. And this led away from the deen of Ibrahim alayhi salam, of the Hunafa. And we know that in our deen in Islam, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is qareeb. This is something, when you talk to students and talk to the youth, they sometimes think God is far away, that God is irrelevant to my life. But we have to teach in our religion that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is qareeb, that he listens, he's mujib, he's sami', he's basir, that he hears, he sees, he's present, he's there to help you and support you in your life. And we see, lastly, the idea of temptation. That in this world that we live in, there are always things that are trying to take us away from the worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Whether it's on your phone, whether it's at work, whether it's advertisements, television, there's always jinnati wan nas, whether it's the jinn or the humans, there are people taking you away from praying on time, from being good to your family, from visiting the sick, from giving part of your money to the poor, to the needy. That there are always things in this world distracting us from the worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this is an opportunity for us to reflect, to look into our hearts in this beautiful day, in this morning of Fajr, to think about our day ahead and to ask ourselves, what is our priority? What is in our heart? And how can we make Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala the ultimate destination of our worship? We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for forgiveness. وَالْعَصْرِ إِنَّ الْإِنسَانَ لَفِي خُسْرٍ إِلَّا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا وَعَمِلُوا الصَّالِحَاتِ وَتَوَاصَوْا بِالْحَقِّ وَتَوَاصَوْا